Well, we need a little more detail than that at my house. Well, thanks.
I'm in Westchester, New York, about 45 minutes north of the city. I guess in my old age, I like just being out in the country and hanging out. And when I do like going into the city, I grew up in the city, but I never had like the suburban experience as a kid. And I think I always kind of wanted that. And this is kind of, yeah, it's there's something about just being somehow connected to nature that I really like.
So people don't know this. Ben and I started at UCLA the exact same year, and Ben dropped out. And, things really haven't worked out for Ben. But Ben, this is a bridge
And things
to,
didn't really work out for you, Scott, either, did
yeah,
they?
it took me a little bit longer. Anyways, can you give us your sort of origin story? I think people know you by your work, but they don't. Tell us, like, becoming Ben Stiller.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a Nepo baby. I grew up around show business. Like my parents were a comedy team, Stiller and Mira. And they acted separately together. And I grew up around that in New York in the 70s. And with my sister, we lived in an apartment on the Upper West Side. And yeah, like it was show business in our life, and I knew from a young age I wanted to be doing something having to do with making movies. I love making movies as a kid. I grew up around show business. My parents weren't always making movies. They were performing, doing comedy, nightclub act and commercials and sitcoms. And but I knew movies were what I really wanted to do. Then I went to, so I kind of grew up in this sort of like, I guess you'd say privileged Upper West Side, Manhattan of the 70s, which I think was a little bit more rougher around the edges. So like I grew up on Riverside Drive in Manhattan, but if you went up to Amsterdam or Columbus, it was, a tougher neighborhood. And that upbringing for me was sort of, it was, you got a lot of tastes of different, experiences of the world, as opposed to, I think, maybe if I'd grown up in LA where my parents hated LA and been in show business where you'd sort of like living, wherever, Brentwood or Beverly Hills or something like that, where it was so much more, segregated, really. And this experience was, I think, for me, kind of what I grew up with. I feel like I've seen New York change a lot over the years. Not that we're talking about that, but I went out to LA to go be a director and an actor, went to UCLA, hated it.
How did you end up at UCLA?
I was not a great student, Scott. I didn't have great grades, and UCLA somehow I was able to squeak in there. I thought LA movies, that world. I loved going to LA as a kid. I kind of sort of like put it, it was sort of this, wonderful world of, like I love the history of the movies and the idea of, going out there and becoming a director. But then, so UCLA, USC, Boston University, and NYU were the four places I applied to. And I got into those four places except for USC.
But you got into UCLA because when we applied, I know a lot about it. I applied the same year. UCLA had an acceptance rate of 76%, but at the time, SC was where rich kids who didn't get into UCLA went. It's shocking you got into UCLA and not into USC.
Well, the film school was a tough film school to get into, I think. But my grades weren't great. And so I somehow got into UCLA and thought, okay, I'm going to do that. And it was I went to this little private school on the Upper West Side of Manhattan where there were like 60 kids in our whole class. And there were open classrooms where it was like the whole floor was basically every learning area was divided just by, these sort of like dividers where you could hear everything going on. So to go to all of a sudden to like a history course at UCLA, where there were like 300 kids in the class and a teaching assistant and all that, it was like, I literally didn't know how to do it. And I was never a great student. I didn't really socialize when I was out there. And I kind of, it's interesting, my son's going to school now in New York, and he's a freshman, and he's just turned the corner the last couple of weeks, his freshman year, of like embracing it and loving it. And I never really opened myself up to that experience.
And what was sort of your first gig? So you dropped out of UCLA. What did you do?
I came back. I remember very well coming back to my parents' apartment, sitting on my bed on a red eye from LA, and like it was like 6 o'clock in the morning, and got back to New York and sitting on the bed and going like, now what do I do? I'm out of school. that moment where you have to figure it out. And basically, uh, I got um, I got a job working as a busboy. I stayed at home with my parents, and I started taking acting classes. And I got an agent and auditioned for about 3 years, and started to get callbacks. Which is where they have to call you back for another audition and get closer and closer to get the part. But it took about 2 years to even get to that point. I just was not great at auditioning. I don't think I was great at being an actor in front of the camera. I wasn't that comfortable. And after a couple of years of doing it, I finally got to a place where started to get better at that process. And then I got a job in this play off Broadway called The House of Blue Leaves by John Guare, and it was at Lincoln Center Theater. And that production was a small part, but the character had a monologue at the beginning of the second act, and the production went to Broadway and ended up winning a bunch of Tony Awards. And I was in that, and everybody came to see that. And from that, a couple of directors came, and I got a small part in Empire of the Sun that Steven Spielberg was directing. And then I got another small part in
Oh,
another
wait,
movie.
Empire of the Sun. I forgot about that.
Yeah, yeah.
What was I remember Christian Bale, but I don't remember Ben Stiller.
Yeah. Ben Stiller is one of the prisoners of war in that prison camp with John Malkovich. And I had maybe two
Oh, I remember
lines.
now. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
Um,
what was your quote unquote big break? Like what sort of what was a step change in your career?
I feel like I had a bunch of little breaks that led to a bigger break. And so I was pursuing both wanting to be an actor and a director, and, and also not really knowing what I was doing, honestly, in terms of having a sense of like I wasn't somebody who came out of the box, like, I'm going to write and direct this movie and I know what it is. I was sort of finding it. And so, I did these little parts in movies, and then I got a chance to be on Saturday Night Live in 1988, I think. And I auditioned with a friend of mine. We made an audition tape. We were doing this little comedy act. So I was sort of like exploring making short films, being in comedy, which I sort of really kind of not wanted to do for a long time, but then started to find a sense of humor, I guess, that I connected with in shows like SCTV and Saturday Night Live too. And so I auditioned and got a job as I made a short film actually for them that I sold to them that was Take Off on the Color of Money with Tom Cruise. And then they hired me to be a writer and or an apprentice writer. And that was at the end of the 88 season. And I knew very quickly that I wasn't going to do well there because I wasn't great at live performing.
You weren't at SNL very long,
No,
no?
I was there like 6 weeks. and, and then I had an opportunity to do a show at MTV. So MTV was just starting up in terms of like doing programming that wasn't videos. And that little comedy act I did with my friend Jeff Kahn,
You had a show, right? The Ben
yeah,
Stiller
the
show?
Ben Stiller
Yeah,
show that
I
was on,
remember
it
that.
was on MTV for like 13 episodes. And then somebody at the fledgling Fox network, which was just starting, they didn't even have full programming then, saw it. And there's a guy named Chris Albrecht who ran HBO comedy, and he produced basically this show that we worked on for a couple of years that we sold to Fox. And then that got canceled after about 12 episodes. But that was probably like my first, like I was doing a show and I was working with Bob Odenkirk and Janine Garofalo and who else? Andy Dick and David Cross and like all these people. We were just sort of starting out, and that got canceled. But then somebody saw that some of those sketches, and Danny DeVito's production company, and they were making a movie called Reality Bites that they were developing with Helen Childress, who was a writer, young writer. And they put us together and we started to work on that movie together. And Winona Ryder signed on to it. And this was probably 1993, 94. And we made that movie. So that was my first movie that I ever directed. Thanks to Winona signing on to it.
And Ethan Hawke was in that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Ethan was in it. And that movie came out and, did okay. But I was also kind of, it's like kind of interesting. I was like doing that. I was a director and an actor because I was in that too. but nobody was really like banging down the door, for me to do the next thing. And then Judd Apatow, who I'd met when we started to work on the Ben Stiller show on Fox a few years before, had been working with Jim Carrey, and Jim signed on to do The Cable Guy, and which originally was a Chris Farley vehicle. And then Jim said he was going to do it, and Judd was going to rewrite it. And Judd suggested me to direct it to Jim, and then we all had a meeting, and it got along. And so this was a point where Jim was just, every movie he was doing was
Bigger and bigger.
bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And so he had total freedom, and it was this weird sort of dark relationship comedy that probably was not a great summer movie for Sony. But, we did it, and it came out and was not super well received.
Was there ever a moment where you thought maybe this isn't the industry for me, or what was kind of? Can you think of one moment that was sort of your lowest moment in the industry?
I never thought it wasn't for me. I never thought I had I really never thought of doing anything else. And I think when you're younger and you have this sort of sense of what you want to do, or this ambition, or this kind of like blind sort of just motivation to go towards something. I wasn't self-aware back then to understand what was pushing me towards it, but I did definitely deal with, Cable Guy. Cable Guy was there was like an article in New York Times, like the first disaster movie of the summer has come out, and it's a comedy called The Cable Guy. That was the review. So that was tough because, in show business, when you make
I think
something.
You're being unfair. You've had a lot of negative reviews in movies. Along came Polly. There's definitely
Oh my God.
envy.
Yeah.
There's.
Well, I didn't get to those yet. This was just
I
the
think
directing.
you're being really hard on The Cable Guy.
Well, I took that one personally because I directed it, and somehow, and yeah, you're right. Like I remember, I think David Denby came out once in the New Yorker and wrote like a 7-page article about why I shouldn't be in movies.
The Heartbreak Kid, Starsky and Hutch, which I enjoyed. Sarah, come on. We're going to need a bigger boat. This is not your press tour, Ben. I'm not here to just blow you and ask you your vision for Severance. Wait, hold on. You were also in Mary Madagascar. Let's talk a little bit about that. Oh my gosh. And then Madagascar 2, Escape to Africa.
That's right. Oh, yeah.
Night at the Museum, Battle of the Smithsonian. Yeah, I'm sure that wasn't for the money.
Yeah,
hold on.
And Madagascar 3, too.
Fresh Horses. I don't even know what the fuck that is. If Lucy Fell.
Well, I could tell you about all of these because each one has an amazing story to it.
Oh my God. If you type in Ben Stiller's worst movies, there's 3 pages. It's like, oh my God. You're the advice. You are the living embodiment of the advice I give to young dudes. And I'm like, go up to everyone and ask them out, and eventually something's going to work. Something's going to work. You have taken so many shots here. Like I'm similarly 1 out of 7 businesses works. So I've started 9.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Right. Well, it's the law of averages.
Anyway, sorry.
No, it's okay. It was an interesting time in terms of, like all those movies, making those movies, because they were just sort of, when the first movie that I ever was in that really did well was There's Something About Mary. And that was in 1998. And, I'd been doing it for a number of years. And then after Mary, I did get a lot of, opportunities. And I think right after that, it was like, you didn't mention Duplex too. Duplex, Envy.
I was holding that.
But, it's a weird thing to go through for sure, though, right? When you're like kind of given these opportunities and coming off of one that finally worked, and then a couple of them that really didn't, that didn't work, was, it's kind of like you have to look at yourself and go, what am I doing here?
What pieces of work surprised you to the downside, and that is you thought they were going to be? I've started 9 businesses, which is not nearly as romantic as cool as making a movie, but I couldn't tell you when I started a company what was going to be successful and what wasn't. And sometimes I was surprised at the upside and sometimes surprised at the downside. What pieces of work surprised you that they weren't as successful as you thought they were going to be? And what other pieces of work you thought, this is good, but it ended up being a huge commercial hit?
Yeah, I don't know. It's really hard to tell. what's going to work and what's not going to work. Like I wouldn't have known. There's something about Mary was interesting because it didn't open at number one. This was in 98, when movies were, there were comedies in theaters. And that movie might have opened like number three or four or something like that. But over the course of the summer, it worked its way to number one after like 9 weeks. And that hardly ever happens. And so that was a surprising thing for sure. But then to see how that movie worked. And then for me, what I was surprised by how that changed all the opportunities for me, because at that point I'd already, I'd done Reality Bites in 93, 94. So I'd been around for a while doing it and was actually I was really happy in my career getting all these opportunities to do different things. But then being in a movie that was a box office success really changed then the sort of like, I think the, sort of lens that people looked at what I was doing. And because then they were like, well, what's the next thing? And then all of a sudden people were paying attention. And yeah, people were going to a lot of those movies. Some of them didn't work, but then some of them really did work. And for the audiences. And, comedies critically have always been, it's always a crapshoot in terms of whether critics will go for them or not. But, I never ever had the feeling going into something like this is going to be the one, you know what I mean? Except for maybe Fresh Horses, because Fresh Horses that was 1987 and I was just, just starting out, and it was Andrew McCarthy and Molly Ringwald, and they were coming off of, Breakfast Club and all these movies. And it was like, this was the Brat Pack. And I was like, oh man, I'm going to be in the Brat Pack. I'm going to be, and the movie just,
This is it. This is my
the
moment.
movie just tanked. And, but it was literally to this day, my favorite experience ever making a movie.
Really?
Yeah. Because it was, it was like 6 20-something-year-old kids in a motel in Kentucky outside of Cincinnati for 3 months, making a movie and having fun and hanging out and hooking up and doing everything. It was just like, it was like the dream. And it was so much fun.
So I know you're dying to know what my favorite works are of yours.
Yes.
First off, my partner is literally obsessed with Severance. For me, your two favorites, probably the Royal Tenenbaums. Oh gosh, actually, you know what? I think Tropic Thunder. I think our friend wrote it, Justin Theroux, and then you directed and starred, and Robert Downey Jr. was nominated. I thought that thing was so unusual. I can't even imagine pitching that movie.
Yeah.
And then the Tom Cruise character. Anyways, but I still like the Royal Tenenbaums the most. I think it was one of Gene Hackman's kind of crowning performances. Which leads me to my question: And don't say Robert De Niro. You've got a pretty deep body of work here. Who are some of the most talented actors that you have directed or worked with that may not be on the tip of our tongue? Like
Right.
we know Gene Hackman's incredible, right?
Yeah.
Who are some of the people you thought, wow, this person is not really appreciated for the depth of their talent?
Well, I mean, I would start with saying that, in Tropic Thunder, he is appreciated. He just won an Oscar last year, but Downey for sure is a genius. And working with him on that movie, I felt like I was working with somebody who was sort of just channeling something in terms of that character, of that actor playing that role, and the courage he had doing that. And also just like he kind of just watching his process, working with him. I love working with him. I love him as a person. He puts this energy into his work that he's aware of the fact that he needs to sometimes he has to allow it to flow and go and try things. And I think in movies, you have to feel free to try things, because you're not going to know what works until you find it, but sometimes it's going to be bad and you're going to put it out there, and you have to feel that freedom. And I really felt like that's what he was doing with that character. And a real humility about the work, but also an incredible sense of confidence too in taking the chances. So I think with him in that movie, and I think everybody in that movie, like Jack Black, everyone was just kind of like doing that on a certain level where they're just kind of going for it. And that's not easy, I don't think, especially in because comedies can go bad, but you have to take those chances. I think, working with Greta Gerwig and Greenberg with Noah Baumbach, which was like her first sort of role that people sort of, discovered her in, and watching, the simplicity of what she was doing, was very, that helps when you're working with an actor who's so real in a scene. That changes everything for you, because you're just, I think so much of acting is reacting. And so, that's why doing something like with De Niro is great, because, you have this amazing person giving you all this and you just have to kind of like take it in.
We'll be right back after a quick break. Let's talk about
failures, more failures.
Literally everyone's glomming all over you on Severance.
I'd rather talk about failure. Let's talk about Madagascar 3. Come on.
Dude, we only have an hour and a half here.
All right. Because you do learn, I don't know this, when you talk about business, right, you really do learn more from the things that don't go well, as we all know. It's very true.
I don't know if you've heard this, but my pivot host, Kara Swisher, has her own podcast called On, and you went on there before you went on my podcast, despite the fact that we're good friends, and I'm constantly talking you up and apologizing and saying that, no, night at the museum, the Smithsonian meets the Folkers, meets whatever. Anyways, you said you had to make the show as soon as you read an early version in a writing sample from its creator, Dan Erickson. What drew you to this? Because and this is why I would never be successful in your industry, when I've watched the show, it reminds me of Game of Thrones. Every time I watch Game of Thrones, one of the things I appreciate most, I'm being serious now, about Severance, is what I appreciate about Game of Thrones, and that is, I can't even imagine pitching this to people and asking them for money to make this. It seems so... If someone had pitched something about the Seven Realms and, sword fighting with dragons, but there's a red woman who's got mystical power, and then someone said, okay, I have this dystopian drama about relationships and our severing between our work and our personal lives, I would have, as a studio exec, thought this could be such a bomb. And the thing about Severance, it reminds me a little bit, and I think Apple's smart in terms of brand positioning, between the talent, Christopher Walken, John Turturro, and the production values. I mean, there's some shots where I think I would just want to leave this shot for 3 minutes because it's so beautiful. You can see the money dripping off the screen, quite frankly. The talent, the production values. That show must have cost a lot of money to produce, and I would have thought there is a high probability of failure. It just really impressed me that you were able to talk them into this. What about it was so intoxicating for you that, as you said on, you thought, I got to do this?
I mean, it all started with a script that Dan wrote, this script that he wrote on spec to send around to get people to meet with him. And it was so clear to me, the tone of it. And what it evolved into is probably its own thing that maybe wasn't quite on the page. But I think the combination of what Dan wrote and kind of what it sparked in me was this, basically, it reminded me of these workplace comedies that I really loved, like Office Space or The Office, and yet it was in this weird world. And that to me was the kind of hook of it. I give Apple credit for reading the script and saying, yeah, we like it, we want to do it. They were starting up. It was like a weird confluence of events where Apple wasn't streaming yet. It was all sort of theoretical in a way, because they were saying like, okay, go ahead, develop these scripts. We like it. At first, I think they thought I was going to like find an office, like an abandoned office, and just shoot it there. And then when we started to talk to them about, no, this is actually going to be, like a kind of a weird, surreal world that we have to create, it kind of evolved into something. But I think, people say yes to things because for some reason they connect with it, but maybe what I was connecting with was maybe a little different than what Apple saw. But I think I have to give them credit for saying, yeah, go ahead and do it. But I don't know how things evolve in this way where you're given the freedom. Maybe it's because of like stuff I'd done before where I was given a little more leeway to experiment. I think when we put together the cast we had, they were excited about that. But nobody knows, you don't know what it's going to become. And
you're rolling the dice.
Yeah. And we never tested it. We never did any, focus groups or anything like that too, which is also kind of weird, because all those comedies back in the day where you always did test screenings and focus groups and all that. And this was one of the first things I did where I didn't have to do any of that.
from an outsider standpoint, you look at the kind of the streaming wars and Netflix spending 18 billion and everybody having to massively increase their budgets. You would logically think, wow, there's never been a better time to be in the creative side of Hollywood. And yet you talk to people, you talk to creatives in Hollywood or in the business, and they say it is awful here right now. Awful. So try and reconcile the two. You've been in the business a long time, and you've been a producer, and you've had to pull the money together. You see the business side of this. You've worked with, I think, most of the major streamers, most of the major movie companies. What observations would you have about how the dynamics of the industry and the biggest shifts? How do you perceive it as a creative, having been in the business for pretty much 40 years now?
Yeah. It feels to me that it's upside down in that nobody really knows uh, how it's going to shake out with the streamers and movies and what people are watching and what's a movie now and how do they make money from the streaming. You know more about this than I do, but there used to be this model that you make a movie and then you'd release it in theaters, it would do money, do business in the theaters, you make money there, and then you go to DVD and VHS, right? And that was the DVD streaming thing became like basically, dead after when streaming happened, DVDs died. And that's changed everything. And I remember my agent telling me that, like, I don't know, like 8, 9 years ago, saying like, it's all going to change. It's all changing. And it was kind of hard to believe, but it really has. I don't think anybody knows where it's going. So there's a lot of fear of, what people are going to go and see in the movie theaters that those studios have. So they've just retreated to making, things that are safe, that they know, that's what sequels are. That's what, known IP is. And it's become sort of polarized in a way where there are these giant movies, and then there are these movies like The Brutalist that are made for, $9 million or whatever and win Academy Awards. But it's two different worlds, and you have to struggle to make the things that aren't going to be, a slam dunk in a pitch. So it's really hard because then post strike, there's been so much retraction too, and the economy is really in a tough place too, and that affects everything. So I would say it's really tough. It's really tough to go out there and pitch an idea if you don't have some star attached or some IP that it's based on or something that, is going to basically, guarantee the streamer or the movie studio that they know they're going to get an audience. And as we all know in show business, nobody knows anything and you never know what's going to work. So people, are not taking as many chances, and it's really tough out there.
I don't know you well, but I've gotten to know you a little bit. And whenever we talk, you inevitably bring up your parents and you bring up your kids. And I want to talk a little bit about, I mean, we all like to think of ourselves as being close with our parents, but you're making a documentary where you're literally going through, my understanding, is old photos. And it feels like just sort of an ode or a nod to them and their lives. I believe your mom died in 15, your dad in 2020. Talk a little bit about your parents, their approach to raising you, and, I don't want to say the impact they had on you, but I don't think I've ever been with you, and within an hour, you don't reference your parents.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think they've been in my mind a lot and just with me a lot because I've been working on the documentary. So the last 5 years I've been working on it and just mixing it and finishing it now. So I think I've been, looking at my relationship with them. I miss them. I think probably when they first passed away, I didn't know how to deal with it as much. And still, I'm trying to figure out how to deal with it. I think anybody, when you lose your parents, there's such an important relationship in your life. And I love my folks. And it's interesting when you have parents who are supportive and love you, and you don't have something to rebel against or to say, my dad was this awful person and I had to get out of the house or whatever. They both had their issues, but they were very loving parents who were also actors and very much about the process of creativity for themselves, which I am too. And that's the thing I've been kind of thinking about a lot the last few years working on this movie is how my own, you know, process as an actor and filmmaker and creative person affects my relationships with my kids, because you have to have a certain amount of selfishness as a creative person where you go, I need to take this time to work on this thing because that's going to make me happy. But then how do you balance that with being there for your family? And that's what I experienced with my parents too. And I, experienced it as a parent with my kids. And I think that's, what I grew up around was my parents working all the time in an apartment on the Upper West Side in Manhattan, where they had a room where they had an office and they'd write commercials and write sketches and go off and do like a part in a sitcom or go do, do their act at a nightclub or, do a little part in a movie or something like that. But they were constantly having to work because they weren't super rich or anything. They had to work for a living. And they never wanted to move to LA and be a part of the whole kind of Hollywood world. My mom had a real aversion to that. My mom was like tough Irish Catholic, very acerbic, very funny. Um, you know, Still, which, say she loved me, but it was, it wasn't like warm and cozy. I think I share my mom's sense of humor more than my dad's. And my dad was much more kind of a soft touch, but he grew up in the Depression with parents who were not that supportive of what he was doing. My mom lost her mom at a young age. Um, and and she was an only child. And I think she built up some walls, but, she was committed to my dad and this work relationship that they had, and they were trying to make a living, and they were trying to just kind of do well in show business. And as parents, they were there was a lot of laughing and a lot of fun, but it was also a lot of feeling the stress of what they had to do to make ends meet, really. And yeah, so I feel like they were. I don't know. But I really, yeah, I really love them. I feel like I had issues with them when they were alive. With my dad, I always had sort of this push pull where I was like, I wanted him to treat me like an adult. And he kind of always coddled his kids and was overprotective. And that led to tension. And I think also part of it was, my mom drank and later got sober in her life and talked about it a lot. And I think my dad was always trying to to balance that. And I think that came out of the tension and stress of having to perform live, which she didn't love to do. My dad sort of drew her into comedy. She was a dramatic actress who then was really good at comedy. And he said, hey, we could do an act together. We can do a comedy act and that can make ends meet, because they were starving, living in an apartment on the Upper West Side in the 50s, trying to, make money. And then that act provided a living and an identity for them. And she never really loved doing it as much.
So I didn't connect the dots. I've never heard the story or the reference of your mom and drinking. Is that one of the reasons why you don't drink? That's one of the first things I noticed about you, is that you don't drink.
Yeah, I mean, I think I stopped drinking about 7 years ago. Yeah, I mean, there was always an awareness in our family. I mean, like I said, my mom was amazing in the last, 10 years of her life. She got sober and quit smoking. She smoked her whole life and talked about it and was, very committed to a program. And that in turn for me, when I got into my 20s, I started to realize what that dynamic was in our family and went my own way to deal with that and find a program to help deal with that for myself. And yeah, an awareness of that has always been part of, I think, for me, looking at the lens of how our relationships with our parents when we're young affect our current relationships. And I think for me, Christine and I, separated about 7 years ago, and we were separated for about three or 4 years. And when we separated, that was when I stopped drinking, because I felt like I wanted to just, be present for whatever was going on, which was, feeling a lot of feelings. And it felt to me like I could go down a road that would not be dealing with the things I needed to deal with if I kept drinking.
Do you think your sobriety led to ultimately some sort of recognition or realization in your life that resulted in your reconciliation?
Well, I think, you have to be present for a relationship, and be available and be, you know, I'm not saying you have to be completely sober and not drink to be in a relationship, but like you have to just, you have to be who you are and acknowledge and take responsibility for, for being there. And if someone isn't, then, it's hard. It takes two to tango. So, I think both, Christine and I, for us, when we came back together was, I think we'd both done work on ourselves on some level that was important so that we could be together. And the great thing is now I recommend, if it's right to come back with somebody, because a lot of times it's not right to come back with somebody. I didn't know we were going to come back together, but now every day it's that acknowledgement of like, okay, this is good. I appreciate this, and it could go away. So I'm going to be grateful for it, and I'm going to be present. And then you figure out for yourself like what that means in terms of your own choices.
We'll be right back.
Support for the show comes from ShipStation. When you're starting an e-commerce business, a big part of your job is to build trust with your customers one package at a time. And one way to keep your customers happy? Using ShipStation. ShipStation grows with your business no matter how big or small. Not only is it good for you, it's good for your customers too, offering shipping discounts of up to 88% off DHL, UPS Express, and USPS, and up to 90% off FedEx rates. ShipStation also integrates with the services and selling channels you're already using, so you can manage your orders on one easy dashboard. You can automate shipping tasks and print shipping labels at the click of a button. And according to their data, more than 130,000 companies have grown their e-commerce businesses with ShipStation using the smart features and automations that were designed to boost efficiency. When shoppers choose to buy your products, turn them into loyal customers with cheaper, faster, and better shipping. Go to ShipStation.com/ProfG to sign up for your free trial. There's no credit card or contract required, and you can cancel anytime. That's ShipStation.com/ProfG.
Back with more from Ben Stiller. We have a lot of young men who listen to the podcast, and I'm curious and a lot of these men are starting families. What advice, and none of us have got this figured it out, but in terms of your own approach to being a dad, the role that your parents have had on you, trying to straddle the line between that tension we're talking about around your own creative process and focusing on your own career such that you can be a provider while being present as a parent, being separated for a few years, that always creates a different dynamic with your kids. What advice would you have for dads as they are thinking about or just starting their journey around fatherhood?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Oh, man. Well, I would say that, coming out the other end here with kids who are in their 20s now, practically, my son's 19, my daughter's 23, it goes by quickly, and there's a really short amount of time that you're able to really, be connected to your kids before they go out into the world. It's not even when they're in their 20s, it's by the time they're whatever, 13, 14 years old, they're socializing, and, there's so many other influences that are coming in. And I think when I was younger with my kids, when they were that age, I was a little bit daunted by parenting. And I might say that my mother, talking about my mom's influence, my mom was daunted by parenting too. I think engaging with your kids, trying to set an example of what you do in terms of to be healthy for yourself, taking care of yourself, but also reaching out to your children and being open to what they're giving back to you in a way that might not be what you had imagined. Um, in other words, like with my daughter, when she was younger, we had a tougher relationship, but it was more because I wasn't meeting her where she was. And I would want her to be interested in something that I was interested in. And she was interested in what she was interested in. And so, having a willingness to to do that. You have to kind of sacrifice a little bit of like what you think you want that relationship to be, and be there, and open to it, and not run away from it, because I think it's, for some guys, it's, having babies and infants and toddlers, it's really intimidating. And I think leaning into it and just knowing that it's a time that's going to go by very quickly, even if it's not the most comfortable for you, because it's a world that you're not that confident in, and being able to just be open to what your kids are giving you back is really important. It's not that easy, I don't think.
Yeah, agreed. And what you said really resonates, and that is, I imagine that my sons would just naturally be fascinated by CrossFit and World War II history, because they would have such a fascination with all things dad that they'd want to be into what I'm into. And then I found out, no, they have no interest in these things. And being a dad means you have to fake interest in what they're interested. Like, oh yeah, let's go get Pokemon cards. I mean,
totally. And by the way, once you do that, you do get a lot back, because all of a sudden you're engaged with your kids.
How is your approach to your primary relationship different post-reconciliation than it was pre-reconciliation? What advice would you have for young men trying to have a fruitful and rewarding relationship with their partner?
Well, a lot of it is, I think, compromise. And, if you really care about this person, you have to figure out, again, like how to meet them where they're at also. If you have a career or something that you're really focused on, or, revolves around, the things you want to do, you have to communicate and really talk about, what's important to both of you. And that's the thing, I guess, I just said it before, but the gift of getting back together is that you realize that, just because you're married, or just because you say you have a commitment to each other, it doesn't mean that it's going to work. You have to be present every day, and have a back and forth where you can say hey, I want to do this thing for me. Can you be there for me? And then when they have something that they need you for, be willing to sacrifice it. I mean, I think sacrifice your own stuff. And I don't know, things like, just, I think a lot of human nature comes out of, insecurity and jealousy in relationships. And, if you can have that confidence of like saying, okay, I'm going to be okay with you going out and doing your thing. If you're in a good relationship, that's going to help you so much. And it doesn't always work out, because sometimes people are in different places and they're not doing what they should be doing. But if you are a good couple and you're meant to be together, you have to give each other the freedom and have the trust.
So I affectionately say we're the exact same age. I affectionately say we're kind of on the back nine, kind of hanging out and waiting for the ass cancer. Like what is literally...
I had the prostate cancer already.
Oh, that's right. Oh my God. That was so...
Yeah, 10 years ago.
That was so uncouth of me. That's right. You actually had prostate cancer. Talk a little bit about that experience and how it changed you.
It's scary. It's scary.
That makes sense.
That
was so awful. I make an irreverent reference to ass cancer, and you raised your hand.
By the way,
oh well, I did have ass cancer.
Scott,
I had prostate cancer.
I've spent a little bit of time with you, and as much as I talk about my kids and my parents, you talk about ass cancer. You are obsessed with ass cancer.
I think we have the beginnings of a Madagascar 6 prostate cancer. Okay. I think it's coming.
There it is. And didn't I tell you that if you get a colonoscopy, I think I told you this at the wedding, you get a colonoscopy, you go to the right doctor, he explains to you why a colonoscopy is a good thing, because if there's stuff in there, they can get it before it gets bad. So anyway, it was very scary, because all of a sudden it's like everything is like, boom, stop. You know what I mean? Everything we're talking about is like, stop. You don't know if you're going to be alive in, 6 months if you don't, if this doesn't get dealt with. It's like your worst fear. And I had a bad diagnosis in terms of like the doctor wasn't great when he told me, PSA test, which I recommend every guy who's like 45 and up does.
And that's kind of unreliable, though.
Yeah, but you have to watch it. And my doctor started testing me early. It was supposed to be 50, but he started testing me around 45, and he saw it growing. And then you do a biopsy when they see something that's spiking up there. which is scary, and they stick a needle in your butt, and it's not good. And then all of a sudden, you know, you're in a room with a guy saying like, yeah, it's cancer. So,
Wait, let me check my notes again. Yeah, it's
yeah,
definitely cancer.
he's like, yeah, so it's cancer. And it was, I got a different doctor because I wanted a better bedside
hoping for
manner.
a different diagnosis.
Yeah, no, I just wanted a guy who was going to actually like just, I felt was like
Hold
a little
your
more,
hand.
empathetic. But then I went to this amazing guy, Ted Schaefer, Dr. Edward Schaefer, who's now chief of oncology at Northwestern. He was at Johns Hopkins at the time, and he met with me, and he laid it out and said, you got to do this operation, and that's the only choice, and did the operation, and that was it.
That was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So cancer free. So, but
Yep.
is it one of those things where it was a speed bump and you're back to what you do, or are there certain instances where you think you approach it or perceive it differently, kind of post that scare?
Well, the great thing about human nature is that, when you get further away from an event as painful, you kind of, you forget it a little bit. My first PSA test that came back, 0 after operation, whatever, when it was like, yeah, you're officially, cancer free, that was, I cannot tell you like what a great feeling that was. So whenever anybody I know, or even somebody I see on Twitter or something says, hey, just got my cancer free diagnosis, that's, to me, I know what that feeling is. And I tried to hold on to it. But if I'm being honest, as the years go by, you do put it in the rearview mirror. But you walk around with a sense of like, at any moment, something could happen. And, this obviously, just because you had cancer once doesn't mean you can't get cancer again. Or something else can happen to us, obviously. So it's an appreciation, I think, and something that you kind of carry with you. There's also, it's traumatic. It's traumatic to go through anything like that. I was really lucky. I was really, really lucky. I have friends who have dealt with, cancer where the treatments have gone on for years, even successful treatments, but, put them through the ringer, and what toll that can take. And the tough thing is being able to go forward and do all this stuff you want to do in your life and just not think about it. But yet, it's like in 3 months, I got to get that scan, and see if I'm, and I've had so many people. Why can't we, Scott, why can't we cure cancer? Seriously, like when all these
very good question.
These like moonshots and money, and like, could, one of these billionaires just put, all the money in the world?
We're curing it slowly. I think just 7 years ago, we passed a threshold where more people survive cancer now than die from it. So I don't think we ever cure it. I think we just get better at figuring out a way that you die from something else.
Yeah.
So we can treat it really well.
But it's also, so it's just like, it takes such a toll on people, even when they're being, it's just off. I mean, but look, it's also.
And you had money. Think
Yes.
about what it's, 40% of American households have some sort of medical or dental debt. It's like, hi, I've got bad news. Your wife has lung cancer. I've got worse news. It's going to bankrupt you.
Yeah. I was incredibly lucky that I didn't have to worry about that at all. And when I think about, just what people have to deal with, on a daily basis when they do get these diagnoses, and also like access to good doctors and, people who care. Cause like I was able to find a different doctor when I didn't like my doctor, but most people can't do that. I have a friend who's involved with AI, and I'm sure you know much more about AI than I do, who says that like in the next 7 or 8 years, they'll be huge.
You keep saying that, Ben. We keep waiting. The whole singularity. We're going to grow limbs and Petri dishes and flying cars. I'm getting pretty cynical.
What do you think? So you think AI is?
Yeah, we're just going to figure out new applications that depress our daughters. I've become very cynical about it. I hope we've been on the age of this great dawn of discovery for what feels like 40 years now, where everyone's saying we're on the edge of unbelief. So AI is obviously a tremendous opportunity to speed the cycle time of testing and discovery. But yeah, so let's cross our fingers. But I'm as you can tell, and you know me a little bit, I'm a glass half empty kind of guy. Just in our remaining time here, we only have a couple minutes. You've been very generous. Where I was headed with our age, if you will, you got a good relationship. My sense is you have a good relationship with your kids. You've obviously like had a pretty, other than several thousand misfires. You occasionally get lucky. Occasionally, with the buckshot of your career, hit something. You really
Right.
have, from all dimensions, you've had a pretty storied career. Like what? Trying literally just, if you can, lowering your guard. What do you want to accomplish? And in 10 years, what are you hoping to accomplish that you haven't yet? Or is it just more of the same?
That's a really good question, because I think about that a lot at this age. I'm sure you do too. It's like so clear that what the runway is, right? And like and time goes by so quickly. I feel like I want to make some more movies that are closer. Like this documentary is probably like the most personal thing I worked on, and I realized, for me, for a long time, I started working before I even knew why I was doing it. I just had this instinct to do it. And now I have a sense of wanting to, I guess, just explore filmmaking in a way for me that will allow me to get closer to expressing myself and trying things and not being afraid of failure and going out and just doing it because I love doing it. And so in 10 years, I hope that I've continued to do that, and then also found the time to just do the things I love doing and be places I love being. But the creative process is really important to me. And honestly, like, I just hope, in 10 years, 20 years, I still have my faculties and I can enjoy the people I love and keep asking these questions of why we're here and what is it all about, and connect with people in some way through the creativity. I love comedy too, because I find it really challenging. But when it's done well, it can really, it really can unlock a lot for people. But I don't know, like for me, I'm still trying to find my voice, I think, even at this late age, to tell you the truth.
Ben Stiller is an actor, director, and comedian responsible for many films, including Meet the Parents, Zoolander, Meet the Fockers,
Fuckers, because it sounds like fuckers.
Just there's like Tropic Thunder. Just it's staggering the book of work here, and most recently the hit TV series, which is just kind of at least rocking the Galloway household. Jesus Christ, I'm sick of hearing about it. Severance, which is airing now on Apple Television. He joins us from his home in Westchester. Ben, occasionally you meet people and you have this image of what they'd be like. You are literally, and this doesn't happen that often, you're exactly as I'd imagine. You're this nice man who has managed to maintain some semblance of humility. I remember when we went to the U.S. Open together, every person that kind of walked by and saw you and was like, oh my gosh, that's Ben Stiller, and would stop. And this happened a dozen times. Every time you made an effort.
Bloomberg reported that Warner Brothers Discovery may reopen negotiations with Paramount. Okay, what else is happening? January inflation data looks like good news at first glance. According to the Consumer Price Index, headline inflation rose 2.4% year over year, which is slightly lower than expected. Meanwhile, core inflation came in right on target at 2.5%. But beneath the surface, the picture is less reassuring. Prices for services, excluding energy, jumped 0.4% in January. That's the fastest monthly pace since July. And there is another wrinkle. We are still missing October data, which is distorting the year-over-year picture. So here is the real question. Is inflation actually cooling, or is the data just wrong? Okay, here to break down this inflation report, we're speaking with Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's Analytics. Mark, good to see you.
Hi, Ed. Good to be with you.
So I want to jump right into this.
Okay.
The CPI report comes out. Inflation's up 2.4% year over year. Really good report on its face. People were excited about it, especially this administration, which, they're saying that basically inflation is coming down. The giant elephant in the room to me, as soon as I saw this, was something that we've discussed in previous conversations when the last report came out and the report before that came out, which is the numbers are probably wrong. And something that we've been talking a lot about is the fact that this shutdown that happened in October caused the Bureau of Labor Statistics to just not count up prices in October. They just made the assumption that inflation was flat, which of course doesn't really make any sense. And that has reverberated through to the numbers that we're seeing in every inflation report subsequently. And so my reaction was, this is just wrong again. And that's what people should be talking about. The numbers are wrong. So talk about that for us. To what extent are these numbers wrong? Are they wrong? And what did you make of this new CPI report for January?
Yeah, Ed, I don't know that I'd overstate the case. I mean, these numbers understate inflation because of the October government shutdown and the fact that the BLs couldn't collect the data for sure. But probably, if you account for that, it probably adds a tenth or two to year-over-year growth. So instead of 2.425, which was top line CPI, core CPI, it's probably 2.5, 2.6, maybe 2.7, something like that. So inflation, if you take these numbers at face value, don't put it into any other context, make the correction I just made, you'd say, okay, it's not great. It's still above where the Fed would consider to be target and what I think most Americans would consider to be comfortable. But it's okay. But, that's not the end of the story. There's a lot more to the story than just these CPI numbers.
Let's hear what else is in the story here. What else should we be focusing on?
Well, there's other measures of inflation. I mean, obviously, the most important is the consumer expenditure deflator, the PCE. That's the measure of inflation the Fed uses to set its 2% target. And we are now getting a lot of more data coming in, the CPI, the PPI, all that information feeds into this other measure of inflation. That's kind of the Bible for inflation measures. Better measures inflation in a better way, accounts for a lot of the problems that the CPI has. And that is going to come in hot for the month of January. When we get that number a month from now, we're going to have a different conversation around that. It's going to come in at least 0.3% up in the month, maybe 0.4, and year over year is going to be close to 3%. And that's the reality of inflation. If you take all the different measures and you add it all up and you make all the corrections and adjustments and everything else, feels like to me inflation is sitting around 3%, not 2%. That's where the Fed wants it. That's where I think most Americans, again, would feel comfortable with. It's closer to 3%.
I think the thing that's confusing for a lot of people is there are all these different measures of inflation. You've got CPI, you've got PCE. There are questions about how those are measured and which one is more accurate. Then you have the third-party data. You have, you've been measuring your inflation over at Moody's. You've got, other sources. And a question is like, what are you supposed to trust? And what is actually the most accurate reading? And what number is the right number? Which is increasingly becoming a real question, especially when the data was kind of messed up in October. Just as an observer, I'm sitting here, I'm like, which number am I even supposed to be focusing on? Like, what would you recommend to people who are trying to figure out what the actual deal is?
Well, this is why I get paid a salary, Ed. I interpret the data for you. Look, the reality is that any data, are an imprecise representation of reality. Some data gives you a more precise representation, others not as precise. None of them are perfect. They all have their flaws and issues, for lots of different reasons, some obvious, some not so obvious. But I think the way to think about this is you take the plethora of information that's available, you weight those pieces of information, data that are more reliable for methodological reasons, survey-based reasons, whatever whatever criteria you're looking at, and you make a judgment as to where we are. This is what the Federal Reserve does when they meet. They have to think about the job market and they have to think about inflation, and this is what they do. They have these kinds of discussions and debates about, well, is this measure better? Is that measure better? What's wrong with this? What about that thing over there? What about these new third-party measures? That's what they do. That's what they do for a living to set policy. So there's no good, unfortunately, I can't give you something you're going to feel really satisfied with. There is no satisfaction here. You've got to take all these pieces of information together and make a judgment based on that imprecise representation of reality.
Yeah. When I look at that, the number that came out, 2.4%. I mean, still that's prices going up, and it's not the 2% number that we wanted. But the information that I'm sort of synthesizing One, the issues that we had in October that we've discussed.
Right.
Two, I'm thinking about tariffs and the fact that tariffs have been passed through at a 96% completion rate, according to this report. 96% of the pass-through is being passed on to consumers. So you've got tariffs, which is, raising prices as well. I'm also going off of just general personal experience, where I go around and I'm paying for things that are a lot more expensive than they used to be, at the grocery store and otherwise. And, I'm putting that all together and I'm thinking like, inflation's not improving. Inflation is getting worse based on, that's my read. But some would say, no, that's not taking the data into proper account, and maybe you're biased for various reasons. So when you look at all of the signals and data points that are out there, what would be your general characterization of inflation right now? Would you say that it is getting better, worse, or about the same?
I think it's too high. I think it's about 3%, and I don't think it's getting any better. I suspect if I give you my forecast, I'd say it's going to get a little bit worse before ultimately it will get better. I mean, we've got more tariff pass-through to go. We've got still seeing the fallout from the effects of the heavy-handed immigration policy on the labor market, on wages, on costs. You can see it in the service price inflation. So, it's high, it's uncomfortably high, and it's not going to get any better, at least not anytime soon. There's all kinds of caveats to that statement. What the Supreme Court decides, what the president does in response to what the Supreme Court decides on the tariffs, so forth and so on. But that's my characterization of it. I will say in response to, Ed's inflation rate, everybody has their own inflation rate, right? Because everyone's buys different things and are focused on different things. My basket of goods and services I buy are different than yours. They're different than, Claire's, the engineer here. So we each have our own, basket of goods. The other thing I'd say is in terms of perception, often what we perceive about inflation is related to what we buy on a regular basis. I buy a cup of coffee every morning. I have beef, once or twice a week. I buy certain kind of clothing regularly. I need electricity every single day, so forth and so on. The prices for those things, gasoline, obviously, because we all, buy gas. Most of us, not you guys in New York, but most of us buy gas once or twice a week. So, those are the things that we see those on a regular basis. We are monitoring those on a regular basis. And so they have a heavier influence on our thinking about what inflation actually is. So there's a lot of things out there, like if you go buy a car, you don't buy that once every 3, 5, 7 years, and but that's still in the price index. By the way, that's another thing to consider. One other big caveat, in the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and in the PCE, there are quality adjustments. So, cars are obvious. Every year, if you go look at the new cars that come out, they're better than the year before. That's measured in the CPI as a quality improvement, and you can actually see price declines. In fact, you're seeing price declines for vehicles in part because of that quality adjustment. So, there's all kinds of things like that make a gap between, what's actually going on in your perception. But I agree with your perception. Inflation is too high. It's uncomfortably high. For most Americans, it's way too high, and it's not coming in.
I think that quality adjustment kind of portrays a good picture of what's happening in the CPI, where, a lot of people, I think, are confused. That year-over-year number in January, it's like, it's not just we're going to measure what prices are in January across the board and then take the difference between what prices were last year. There are so many of these imputations and adjustments that they're making on a rolling month-to-month basis, which is why the numbers are so soft. And it's so unsatisfying for someone like me who wants the real answer.
Yeah. I mean, were you raised as an engineer? It sounds like you were. I mean, you want precision. There's no such thing.
I was not.
There's no such thing.
I was not.
Okay. But here's the other thing. There's so-called, what economists call base effects. So every January, you get a lot of businesses, that's when they raise their prices for whatever it is that they're selling, right? It's the beginning of the year. They say, okay, now we're going to start with this new price increase. And in recent years, last couple, 3, 4 years since the pandemic, you saw big price increases in January. We saw a big price increase in January, but not quite as big. So this goes to seasonal adjustment. The seasonal adjustment makes things look weaker than they otherwise would have been. So even though it's year over year, you still have those adjustment effects and those base year effects. And so that's also probably pushing down the measured CPI rate year over year, and making it inconsistent with how we think and feel about inflation broadly.
Just looking ahead, your forecasting for inflation, you mentioned you think that it's going to get a little bit worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
Speak more before we end here about what you expect will happen to prices across America over the next, say, 12 months.
Yeah, if you told me over the next 6 months, the year-over-year rate of inflation, let's use the PCE because I think that's just what we should be using, is going to go from 3% to 3.25%, could be as high as 3.5% by mid-year. And then it'll start to fade because, we'll get there's still more pass-through to go between businesses to consumers on the tariffs. 96%, I think that's that New York Fed study you're probably referring to, that the 96% pass-through was to consumers and businesses. There's still a lot more to go from business to consumer, and that's going to happen. And so I expect some higher, but by the end of the year, we'll get through the other side of that, and we should start to see some moderation. And I'm hopeful, fingers crossed, that
get to this point.
Yeah, this kind of long and coming kind of ideological collapse inside the DOJ's antitrust division, finally came to a head last week. Gail Slater, as you said, is out. It happened a couple days after her top deputy left. And there had been these flashpoints, mostly over a handful of large mergers that had been brewing almost since the early days of the Trump administration. And the simplest version of the story, which I actually have some doubts about, but that there were these big corporate mergers. You might remember HP Enterprise trying to buy Juniper Networks. There was a large merger of two real estate brokerages where the consensus was that the DOJ had some questions and were skeptical that those mergers would result in sort of a lessening of competition in those markets, and that the companies hired a bunch of lobbyists and went over their heads to the White House, to Trump officials at DOJ, and they kind of got waved through. And there's a little bit of truth to that. I think it's probably a little overblown, and there's some other reasons that this was kind of never going to work, but that the tensions just sort of boiled over, and Gail Slater served at the pleasure of the president, and that ran out.
So you've been reporting on this. A few weeks ago, you wrote, quote, "Companies whose mergers have been challenged or investigated by Slater's office have won favorable settlements by going around her to lobby Trump DOJ officials." You also pointed out that one of her deputies, Roger Alford, that he said the decisions are made, quote, "depending on whether the request or information comes from a MAGA friend." That guy was later pushed out. So he gets pushed out. Now Gail Slater gets pushed out. This has been building for a while. This seems to me to be the big story that no one is talking about. This idea that Gail Slater and her team actually tried antitrust enforcement, but then if a friend of the president or a friend of the administration comes along, they can just go around her and they don't have to deal with the enforcement, which seems kind of like corruption, at least to me. Is it not?
Look, the Trump administration has a lot of channels that don't exist in other administrations, and companies are using those to their advantage. That said, the Department of Justice is run by the Attorney General, who's appointed by the president, and it is not crazy to say that he wants people in those seats who share his politics and his ideology. And what's interesting about all of this is that coming into the Trump administration, there was a sense that we were going to have this sort of MAGA populist. There's a strain of MAGA that is almost very progressive in its dislike of big corporations and its skepticism of mergers and corporate power. And, people talk about kind of the horseshoe theory of politics, where the kind of Bernie bros and the Steve Bannons of the world are share a lot, have a lot in common on this particular issue. They were sort of jokingly called conservatives. These are Republicans who liked what Lena Khan, the Biden antitrust cop, was doing in sort of really aggressively swatting away these mergers and challenging monopoly business models. And so there's a sense coming in that you were going to see sort of an interesting tension. And it's just so obvious to me that the populists have lost that fight. You can argue about to what extent Gail Slater was ever really inclined to pursue it. But that, I think the simplest explanation is that it was never real. That really what we were seeing was a dislike, like visceral dislike inside the White House and the Trump campaign and then administration of big tech for mostly personal culture war reasons, right? That getting thrown off these platforms was like an incredibly searing formative experience for a lot of these guys. And it's a grudge that they have really nursed. And that the platforms bigness allowed antitrust to be kind of the way that got enforced and talked about, but that problem has sort of solved itself, right? As Mark Zuckerberg has pivoted Meta away from, content, from policing content, and Elon Musk's X is like sort of undeniably back and like relevant in a way. And so those fights have just sort of lost their edge, which means that the sort of usefulness of antitrust enforcement as a way to express those views just kind of went away. And so I think this is just sort of the inevitable collapse of like an ideological coalition that we all kind of wanted to be there because it was interesting. Strange Bedfellows are fun politics, but I'm not sure it was ever real.
Yeah, it's becoming clearer than ever that it was never actually about antitrust. It was never about monopolization. It was about wokeness and censorship.
I think that's basically right.
And that's what we saw with Netflix as well, right?
For sure. I mean, there's lots of mergers that would never sort of get to your radar or mine, but that like the DOJ's sort of day-to-day job is challenging those because they are anti-competitive in smaller markets. And we didn't see any of that either. It's not like, Gail Slater was bringing cases left and right over like the consolidation of some dental practices in Arizona. I mean, that wasn't, I think if you were looking for signs that there was like a real appetite to continue really what the Biden administration's policy had been, which is deterring consolidation, we never really saw that.
It's really interesting because, on this show, we're kind of pro antitrust regulation or antitrust enforcement. I think this is something we've been talking about for a long time, at least at Prof G, which is the just continued consolidation of big tech and this feeling that we want some level of antitrust enforcement, but it's never actually going to happen. And I think the best example was what happened with Google last year, where it was agreed, yes, they were operating an illegal monopoly. But then when it came to figuring out what the remedies were going to be, they decided, actually, we're not going to issue a remedy because AI is now happening and it's a different time now and it doesn't really make sense anymore. We thought that Gail Slater was going to be sort of the champion, or maybe not the champion, but she was sort of the sleeper pick who was actually going to crack down on antitrust. And it was one of these people that I was like, okay, maybe Trump's actually picked someone decent here. We then spoke with Jonathan Cantor, who was the former head of the antitrust division at the DOJ. I asked him what he thought about Gail Slater. Here's what he had to say about her.
I know Gail. She's extremely talented. She's very well qualified. She's level-headed. And certainly the kind of person you would expect to be in a position like this. And so this is not somebody who's on the fringe. It's not somebody who comes in without any experience. It's not a made-for-TV job posting like perhaps in some other areas. This is somebody who's a serious, dedicated antitrust lawyer, and I think is well respected in the antitrust community.
I guess my question would be, would you agree with that characterization? And is it not kind of a shame that someone who both sides of the aisle seem to agree was pretty good is now out, I guess, because she didn't do whatever Pam Bondi told her to do?
I mean, that is the reality of this administration, right? That a plurality or a majority of people who come through it kind of come out worse on the other side. But I'm curious, when did you talk to Jonathan? Was that on the way in when Slater was appointed?
That was right after the nomination, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really did capture the hope that sort of both progressives like Jonathan and sort of MAGA populists like Steve Bannon, and by the way, like J.D. Vance, right, who had very nice things to say over the years about Lena Khan and thought that companies were too big. There was a sense that there was some sort of political realignment happening around this issue, and it just like obviously did not. Amazon
is down 17%. In fact, it fell for 9 straight days last week, its longest losing streak since 2006. So why has this destruction happened? Well, as we've discussed before, it's all because of AI. A few weeks ago, OpenAI and Anthropic released new AI tools. Those tools went viral. They showed they can pretty much do everything that a white-collar worker is supposed to do. And since that happened, roughly $2 trillion in market value has been erased. And the idea behind this sell-off is that AI is going to make legacy tech companies irrelevant. Why would you pay for traditional software if you can just vibe code your own software with Claude? This applies to Amazon too. Why invest in a legacy e-commerce company when AI might upend online shopping altogether? Now, I have laid out before why I don't think this sell-off makes much sense. I don't think these legacy software companies are going to get nearly as hard as the market seemed to think. I think that for various reasons, such as enterprise security and switching costs, lots more reasons which you can read about on my Substack. I run through the whole thing. But when it comes to Amazon, there is another very big and not very talked about reason why this sell-off really doesn't make any sense at all. And I'm going to tell you what it is. But before I do that, let me first just remind you how badly Amazon is getting punished right now. So Amazon has historically traded at 57 times earnings. It is currently trading at 28 times earnings. Just to put that in perspective, Walmart, whose revenue grew less than 6% last quarter, year over year, Walmart is trading at 47 times earnings. Costco, which has practically no digital footprint at all, is trading at 55 times earnings. Meanwhile, Amazon, whose growth rate is nearly twice as high, is trading at a multiple that is nearly twice as low as those companies. So Wall Street hates Amazon right now. And the reason they hate it is, again, because of AI, because of the disruption that AI companies like Anthropic, like OpenAI could levy on their business. Okay, now I'm going to tell you why this sell-off is stupid. And it's quite simple. The reason it is stupid is because Amazon owns nearly a fifth of Anthropic. In fact, Amazon is one of Anthropic's largest and earliest investors. They have invested roughly $8 billion in Anthropic, going back as far as 2023, before most investors even knew what this company was. So what that means is that any success that is achieved by Anthropic will also be achieved by Amazon and by Amazon shareholders. Why? Because they literally own the business. Now, some investors know all about this. But as someone who spends most of their time talking about these companies, what I can tell you is that it is shocking how many people don't know about it. It is rarely acknowledged in research notes. It's almost never discussed in analyst calls. It's not even treated as a footnote. It's treated as something even smaller. It's almost as if this investment doesn't even exist. So why is no one talking about it? Why is no one talking about the fact that Amazon owns nearly a fifth of Anthropic? Well, I've thought about it, and the answer is now clear to me. The reason no one is talking about it is because Amazon isn't talking about it. In fact, Amazon doesn't really talk about it at all. Supposedly, their Anthropic stake is now worth more than $60 billion, which would imply that they own more than 16% of the company. But that is based on an internal review of their balance sheet, which is based on an internal valuation of Anthropic. And it actually has nothing to do with the current market price of Anthropic based on its most recent funding round. So what that basically means is we actually don't know how much of Anthropic Amazon actually owns. We can make assumptions, and based on our assumptions, it is more than 16%. But it could be even higher than that. We actually don't know. Why? Because they haven't told us. Amazon has given us almost nothing. So this is an open letter to Andy Jassy and to the Amazon executive team. Your stock has fallen 17% in the past month. You don't have a business problem. Your business is tearing right now. You have a multiple problem. You have a valuation problem. Investors don't like the story you're telling about your company. They specifically don't like the story you're telling about AI. And that is because you're omitting one of the most important elements of the story, which is that you are one of the largest and earliest investors in the hottest AI company in the world. That is a very big deal, and it needs to be communicated. So my message to Andy Jassy is the following. Tell us about it. Tell us exactly what the terms are with Anthropic.
Well, I have a lot of experience here because I've started a lot of companies that have failed. I've started some that have been successful. And the wonderful thing about America is you only need a couple successes. And if it does really well, you're set for the rest of your life. Okay, so greatness is in the agency of others. I've typically, until the last 10 years of my life, where I had the credibility and I thought the skill to start businesses on my own, I always had a partner. I started my first business. My first business was a video rental business when I was 24. I partnered with my friend Lee Lotus. My next business was Profit Brand Strategy. I partnered with my business school classmate, Ian Chaplin. I typically started businesses with other people. So one, I think it's more fun to build something with someone else. And when you're young, you want to round out your skills with someone else who has the skills you don't have. And that's the key, finding a partner with different skills. And also being generous with each other. Nothing snatches defeat from the jaws of victory more than when you aren't generous and don't get along with your partner. It can just fuck up a company that has everything going for it. Whenever I see a good company flying apart at the seams, I know that it's the partner's not getting along. The first thing you got to do is find really talented people, give them a piece of the business, paint a vision for why you think it's going to be successful, treat them well, identify the few key players in your company, your small business, and nail their feet to the ground. Say, I'm going to give you 10% of this company. My first hire, I hired students when I started L2. And my first hire, full-time hire, was a woman named Maureen Mullen. I paid Maureen $15 an hour. She had her consulting offer rescinded. This was 2008 or 2009. I started her, I think, at 15 or $20 an hour. She was so good. I said, look, I don't have the money to pay you a market competitive salary, but I'm going to give you 10% of the company. Fast forward 7 years later, we sold for $158 million. So things worked out for her. But you want to identify a core group of people and a partner, I think, early on. That's everything. 2, revenues make a business, not expenses. I still make this mistake when I start a business. I think, I've got to rent an office space. I need to hire a bunch of people. I need to have nice furniture. I need to do some advertising. Fuck that. A business is about revenues. Now, I've always been in services business, so don't take a lot of capital. But don't fall under the illusion that just because you can raise a lot of money or cheap capital, that spending it makes a business. It doesn't. Sure, there are some businesses, specifically in tech, where you do need to make investments. But I'm pretty sure that every investment I made in 2021 is underwater or gone to zero. Why? There was so much capital available that it wallpapered over shitty ideas and people spent too much money. What is the number one indicator of my 9 businesses' success? Was it the idea? No. I don't know if one idea was better than the other. Was it the people? I had good people in almost all my businesses. It was the following. Did I start it during an economic boom or coming out of a recession? The companies I started at the tail end of a boom, 99, 2007, almost always failed. Everything's expensive. People are expensive. Mediocre people cost a ton of money. Some lame systems engineer comes into your office barefoot and demands a 30% increase in salary every 2 months. When I started Profit in 1992 out of business school, we were coming out of a recession. When I started L2, it was 2009, 2010. We were coming out of the great financial recession. Those are great times to start a business. So you want to find good people. You want to make sure you don't overspend. I think you want to overserve those first few clients. I think you need to be sort of mentally and physically resilient. I think your relationship needs to be in a good place. I think you have to work exceptionally hard. Fair isn't a productive word. Also, I think you need a kitchen cabinet immediately to advise you around stuff. Also, I hate to say this, you have to be ruthless when it comes to your first 10, 20, 30 employees. Everybody has to be adding value. You don't have time to manage. You don't have time to figure out roles. You don't have time to put people on performance plans. People have got to show up. They've got to be in it. I mean, they got to come to play. But all of these are really, it comes down to people, good judgment, and make sure you attract a lot of people around you. Greatness is in the agency of others. Good luck, and thanks for the question.
Hey, Prof G. Got some quick questions from a fresh college grad here. For context, I am from and just graduated college in Indiana, and I'm moving to LA in a month. I couldn't be more excited as I've always wanted to live in a big city like LA, and I love what I'm going to be doing. I'll be working sales and business development at a Series B retail tech startup with around 70 employees and for a super experienced leadership team that I really believe in. With 2 huge new life changes occurring simultaneously, I'd love to hear your advice as you've been in both of these positions before. First, how can I maximize my value for the company I'm working for as an entry-level hire? What are some actionable steps that I can take to really stand out and be successful? With an IPO on the horizon in a couple of years, I want to pour all I can as I have stock options on the table. Also, how can I maximize my life outside of work in a cultural hub like LA? I appreciate you, Prof G.
So first off, anonymous. Can you not be anonymous? And specifically, can I be you? My God, you're just graduated from Indiana and you're moving to LA with a good job. Boss, you are in the sweet spot. Okay, what to do? First off, figure out when everyone gets to work and try and show up a few minutes before them and a few minutes later. When I started at Morgan Stanley, I wasn't as talented as the other kids, not because UCLA wasn't an amazing education, but because I didn't work very hard at UCLA and I just didn't have the same skill set they did. So I decided to lean into my strengths. My strengths were my youth and my fitness and the fact that I did not have dogs, kids, or girlfriends waiting for me at home. I was living at home with my mother. I had literally no relationships, nothing going on. So I said, here's an idea. I'm going to go into work Tuesday morning and I'm going to work till Wednesday night at 5 every week. And I developed a reputation for this crazy kid who worked 36 hours straight, but crazy in a good way because investment banking had this sort of weird, fucked up, abusive culture in the 80s and 90s. And I'm not suggesting you go to that extreme, But try and be kind of first in, last out. Show that you come to play. Josh Brown from CNBC and from Ritz-Hold Wealth Management had a really good idea that I thought was very simple. I never thought about it. Find the shittiest part of your boss's job and take it off their plate and slowly but surely try and give them time back. If you can do anything, whether it's responding to RFPs, I don't know what job you're doing, but try and really understand, learn and do stuff and volunteer for stuff. And do your best to try and take the worst part of other people's jobs off their plate such that you become indispensable to them. Because if you make their life easier, you're going to be indispensable. Try and always praise people behind their backs. Be known as the guy that praises people behind their backs. Listen when you're in meetings. Try and really understand what's going on. Be very social. Ask people out to coffees. Ask them a bunch of questions. You don't need to be explicit about finding mentors. I've never said to anyone, will you be my mentor? But I am blessed with a ton of mentors because I would ask them out for coffee. I'd ask them a lot of questions. When you're older and you've got some experience under your belt, you like it when people ask you questions. It's the reason I have this damn podcast is I like giving advice. You feel like you have value to add and you want to share it with young men and young women. So don't be afraid to ask people out for coffee and ask for their advice, ask for their feedback. And generally speaking, I think success is in the last 10%. What do I mean by that? We used to write RFPs at my first job at Morgan Stanley. And Morgan Stanley had this kind of cultural zeitgeist where if there were any errors, you could be fired. And we used to read things not only forwards to prove them, but then backwards to make sure that everything was perfect. And it was very stressful, but it was an outstanding training. So what I would try and bring is a massive attention to detail. Success is in the last 10%. And be known also as the guy that anything that leaves your desk is near perfect or perfect. And don't be afraid to ask people. If you're sending a document or sending an email that's sort of important, ask people, say, can you review this for me? Don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to offer help. Praise others, share credit, ask people out, be curious, be known as someone who's a real team player. In terms of LA, oh my God, is El Coyote still around? Is the Hollywood Bowl still around? Maybe the Greek Theater, maybe Zuma Beach? Shit, I don't know. What not to do? Jesus Christ, what not to do? The Uber drivers in LA are hot. Everything about LA is wonderful. Maybe go to the counter at Beverly Hills Hotel and tell them that Scott Galloway sent you. I don't know. Maybe go to the Polo Lounge on a date, order a drink or two. Maybe go to the, I don't know. Jesus Christ, there are so many amazing things to do in LA. I love the influence that Mexican culture has had on LA. I love the fabulousness of the entertainment industry. I don't know, take a run on the beach, maybe go down to Shutters, have a little drink down there on La Playa de Los Angeles. Boss, you're going to get into so much trouble there. It is such a wonderful place to live. You are in the sweet spot of your life. Be kind, work your ass off. Also get someone with really good taste to buy you kind of 5 good work outfits. I don't know if it's a suit or whatever. So you have a uniform. You don't need to think about it, but you look competent.